The Texas sun beat down mercilessly on the dusty parking lot of the Broken Spoke Saloon, a modest establishment that had stood the test of time in Austin, refusing to bow to the glass skyscrapers rising in the distance. The sign above the entrance, featuring a wagon wheel with a shattered spoke, had faded over the decades, but the reputation of the place remained as ironclad as the spirit of the man who was about to have his world invaded. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of stale beer, sawdust, and memories, a sanctuary where time moved slower than the traffic on I-35. But miles away, in a realm that smelled of ozone and static electricity, time was moving at the speed of light, and a weapon was being forged not from steel but from zeros and ones. The visual shifted violently from the warm amber hues of the Texas hill country to the cold, aggressive neon green of a computer terminal. In the vacuum of cyberspace, there was no dust, only data. Lines of code cascaded down a black screen like digital rain, frantic and relentless. A progress bar glowing with a malicious intent inched toward completion. The file name was stark, clinical, and devastatingly private. GS Private Session, your 1989.wave. It hovered in the digital void, a ghost caught in a machine waiting to be unleashed. Cut to the physical world, to a room that felt more like a surgical theater than an office. This was the headquarters of Streamline Digital, located on the 35th floor of a gleaming spire in downtown Nashville. The air conditioning hummed with a deafening artificial silence, scrubbing the atmosphere of any human warmth. Julian Vane, the CEO of Streamline, stood before a wall of monitors, his reflection ghosting over the data streams. He was a man of 30, dressed in a suit that cost more than most farm trucks, with eyes that saw music not as art, but as a harvestable asset. He held a glass of cheap champagne, the bubbles rising rapidly, mirroring the adrenaline coursing through the veins of the young intern sitting at the main terminal. Vane tapped the glass against his teeth, a nervous, rhythmic tick. He was about to do the impossible. He was about to force relevance upon a legend who had never asked for it. The marketing strategy was bold, aggressive, and entirely unethical. They would leak the file, a raw, unpolished recording stolen from the physical archives of a defunct studio bought out by Streamline's parent company during a liquidation sale. It was a demo, a rough cut. A moment of vulnerability from the king of country, George Strait, recorded decades ago with a man who was dead before the sun came up the next morning. Vane didn't care about the context. He cared about the engagement metrics. He cared about the launch of his new AI-driven streaming platform, Echo Chamber, which needed a viral event to secure its Series B funding. The intern, a boy named Tyler who had likely never held a physical record in his life, looked up, his finger hovering over the enter key. His face was pale, illuminated by the harsh blue light of the screens. He hesitated. Even in his youth, he felt the weight of what they were doing. It felt like trespassing. It felt like walking into a church and screaming profanities. "Do it," Vane whispered, his voice slicing through the hum of the servers. "Push the button, Tyler. We are making history. We are liberating content. The world deserves to hear this." George is old school. He doesn't understand that privacy is an obsolete concept. We are doing him a favor. We are immortalizing him in the blockchain. Tyler swallowed hard and pressed the key. On the screen, the progress bar hit 100%. The text flashed, "Upload complete. Dissemination protocols active." For a second, nothing happened. It was the calm before the digital storm. Then the first ping echoed in the room, then another, then a cascade. The file appeared on obscure audiophile forums first, then leaped to Reddit, then exploded onto Twitter. The hashtags began to trend within seconds. The Lost Session, George Strait leak, Ghost Track. The algorithm, hungry for novelty, seized the file and flung it to the four corners of the globe. Millions of impressions flooded in. Comments, shares, reaction videos. The internet was feasting on a carcass that wasn't even cold, dissecting the raw emotion in George's voice, analyzing the imperfect guitar strumming, stripping away the intimacy of the moment until it was just another piece of content to be consumed and discarded. Julian Vane smiled, watching the numbers climb vertically. He took a sip of the champagne. It tasted like victory. He believed he had hacked the system. He believed he was untouchable. 700 miles away, The wind blew through the mesquite trees of a ranch south of San Antonio. Here, the only notifications were the rustle of dry leaves and the distant whinny of a horse. George Strait stood by a wooden fence, his gloved hands resting on the rough cedar post. He was looking out at the horizon, where the Texas sky met the earth in a haze of purple and gold. He was 69 years old, and the lines on his face were a map of the miles he had traveled and the songs he had sung. He wasn't wearing stage clothes. He was in worn Wranglers, a dust-covered work shirt, and a black resistal hat that had seen more rain and sun than most people saw in a lifetime. He was at peace. He had spent the morning checking the herd, working the land that kept him grounded while the world worshipped him as royalty. He didn't know about the servers in Nashville. He didn't know about the algorithms or the hashtags. He didn't know that his most private grief was currently being played through the tinny speakers of smartphones in subway cars in New York and coffee shops in London. The silence of the ranch was broken not by a digital chime, but by the harsh mechanical ringing of a landline telephone inside the main house. It was a sound from another era, insistent and urgent. George turned his head slowly. He rarely got calls on the landline during the day. Only family, only emergencies. He patted the neck of the sorrel mare standing next to him, whispering a soft goodbye, and walked toward the house. His boots crunched on the gravel path, a steady, rhythmic cadence that had anchored 1,000 songs. He entered the house, removing his hat out of habit and respect for the home his wife, Norma, kept immaculate. The phone was still ringing in the kitchen. He picked up the receiver, the plastic cool against his ear. "Hello," George said. His voice was calm, deep, the same voice that had soothed millions of broken hearts, but now it was stripped of melody, just a man answering a call. On the other end was Harlan Howard, a producer who had retired 10 years ago to a fishing cabin in Arkansas. Harlan's voice was shaking. He sounded out of breath, as if he had run a mile to get to the phone. "George," Harlan stammered, "you need to sit down." "I'm standing, Harlan. What's wrong? Is it Norma? Is it Bubba?" George's grip on the phone tightened, his knuckles turning white under the leather of his work glove. "It's not the family, George. It's the session, the '89 session with Towns." George froze. The air in the kitchen seemed to drop 20 degrees. The ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway became deafening. That name, Towns, and that year. It was a door George had closed, locked, and welded shut. "What about it?" George asked, his voice dropping to a whisper that was more terrifying than a shout. "It's out, George. It's everywhere. Someone leaked it, I don't know how. That tape was supposed to be in the vault at the old soundstage studio, but you know they sold the assets last year to some tech conglomerate. It's on the internet, George. They're remixing it, they're talking about it, they're selling ads on it." George closed his eyes. He didn't see the kitchen anymore. He saw a dimly lit studio booth in 1989. He smelled the cheap whiskey and the stale cigarette smoke. He saw his friend Towns sitting on a stool, looking frail, his eyes haunted, but his fingers still magic on the fretboard. They had recorded one song. Just one. A song about leaving this world before you were ready. They had laughed after the take. They had hugged. And 6 hours later, Towns was gone. An overdose. A heart failure. A tragedy that George had mourned in silence, refusing to release the track because it felt like profiting from a tombstone. It was a prayer, not a product. And now, strangers were walking through that sanctuary with muddy boots. "Who did this, Harlan?" George asked. "A company called Streamline Digital, in Nashville. They're claiming they own the rights because they bought the physical master tape in a bulk auction. They're calling it the Holy Grail of Country. George, they're launching an app with it." George hung up the phone. He didn't say goodbye, he didn't slam the receiver. He placed it back on the cradle with a deliberate, terrifying gentleness. He stood there for a moment, the silence of the house returning, but it felt different now. It felt violated. He looked at his hands. They were shaking just slightly, not from fear, from a rage that burned cold and deep, a fire fueled by an old code of honor that the modern world had seemingly forgotten. He walked to the hallway closet and took out a small overnight bag. He didn't pack a suit. He packed fresh shirts, clean jeans, and a different hat, his formal black felt, the one he wore when he meant business. He walked to the safe in his study. He didn't take a gun. He took something else. He reached into the back of the safe and pulled out a small, battered cassette tape case. Inside was the original master copy, the one he had taken from the studio that night, leaving a decoy behind. The one Harlan thought was lost. The one Streamline Digital thought they had. They had a second-generation copy, a safety reel. George held the true master in his hand. It was the only thing that mattered. He walked out to his truck, a white Chevy Silverado dually, parked in the shade of a live oak. He climbed in, the heavy door thudding shut like a bank vault. He turned the key, and the engine roared to life, a mechanical beast waking up. Norma appeared at the porch door, wiping her hands on an apron. She saw the look in his eyes through the windshield. She didn't ask where he was going. She knew. She had seen that look only a few times in 40 years. It was the look of a man who was going to set the world right, no matter the cost. She just nodded. George touched the brim of his hat to her, shifted the truck into gear, and drove down the long gravel driveway. Dust billowed behind him, obscuring the ranch, obscuring the peace he was leaving behind. The drive to the private airfield was a blur. George didn't listen to the radio. He didn't want to hear the chatter. He didn't want to hear the DJs speculating about the mystery track. His mind was focused on one thing, the face of the man who thought he could sell a dead man's soul. 2 hours later, his private jet, a Falcon 900, was cutting through the clouds over the Mississippi River. George sat alone in the cabin, staring out the window. The world below looked like a patchwork quilt, orderly and silent. But he knew that down there, in the invisible wires and signals connecting the cities, a war was being fought, a war between the ephemeral and the eternal. He landed in Nashville just as the sun was setting. The city had changed since he first started coming here in the early 80s. The skyline was jagged with glass and steel, cranes looming over the old brick buildings of Music Row like vultures. The neon lights of Broadway were already flickering on, calling to the tourists who wanted a sanitized taste of the honky-tonk life. George bypassed the waiting limousine service. He rented a simple Ford F-150 from the airfield, needing to feel the road under his own control. He drove toward downtown, navigating the traffic that clogged the arteries of the city. He saw billboards for New Country, faces of kids who looked more like models than musicians, advertising songs about trucks they didn't drive and dirt roads they had never walked. He pulled up to the glass monolith that housed Streamline Digital. It was an intimidating structure, designed to make a human being feel small. It had no front porch, no welcoming door, just a revolving glass entrance guarded by security turnstiles and cameras. George parked the truck in a loading zone. A valet rushed over, looking annoyed. "Sir, you can't park here. This is for executives and deliveries only." The valet was young, with a headset and an attitude. George stepped out of the truck. He stood 6 feet tall, but in that moment he seemed 10 feet tall. He adjusted his hat and looked the valet in the eye. The boy stopped talking. He recognized the face. Every person in Nashville, no matter how young or how removed from the roots, recognized that face. It was like seeing Mount Rushmore step out of a vehicle. "I'm making a delivery," George said softly. "Keep the engine running, son. I won't be long." The valet nodded, mute, and stepped back. George walked toward the entrance. The automatic doors slid open with a hiss. The lobby was vast, white and sterile. A massive digital screen covered one wall, displaying a waterfall of data, stock prices, streaming numbers, trending topics. And there, in the center of the screen, was his own face, a photo from 1989, grainy and soulful, next to a graph showing millions of downloads. He approached the reception desk. It wasn't a desk, it was a floating slab of marble. Behind it sat a young woman wearing a headset, typing furiously on a holographic keyboard. She didn't look up. "Name and QR code, please," she said, her voice robotic. "I don't have a code," George said. "Then you can't enter the elevators. Company policy. Please step aside so I can assist the next avatar." George placed his hands on the marble slab. He leaned in. "My name is George Strait. I'm here to see Julian Vane." The receptionist stopped typing. She looked up, annoyed at the interruption, ready to recite a script about security protocols. Her eyes widened, the color drained from her face. She looked at the screen behind her, then back at the man standing in front of her. The disconnect was palpable. The digital avatar on the wall was a commodity. The man in front of her was a force of nature. Mr. Strait, but you don't have an appointment. Mr. Vane's calendar is optimized for the next 6 months. He's in a board meeting regarding the launch. Call him, George said. Tell him the ghost he's trying to sell is in the lobby. The receptionist fumbled with her headset. Her fingers shook as she dialed. While she whispered frantically into the microphone, George turned and looked at the lobby. He saw young men in hoodies and expensive sneakers walking by, staring at their phones, oblivious to the world around them. They were the architects of this new reality, builders of a prison made of convenience. Up on the 35th floor, the mood was electric. Julian Vane was popping another bottle. The initial metrics had surpassed projections by 300%. The ghost track was the #1 topic in the world. Advertisers were calling. The stock price of their parent company was rallying in after-hours trading. Sir, Tyler the intern interrupted, looking at his console. Security is on line 1. They say George Strait is downstairs. Vane laughed, a loud barking laugh. Of course he is. I told you, he's here to negotiate. He smells the money. He wants his cut. This is perfect. We'll get a photo op. The king blesses the future. Let him up. Bring him directly to the conference room. And Tyler, start recording. We want his reaction for the documentary. Back in the lobby, the turnstile light turned green. You can go up, Mr. Strait, the receptionist said, her voice trembling. 35th floor. George walked through the gate. He didn't rush. He entered the elevator, a glass capsule that shot upward on the exterior of the building. As he rose, the city of Nashville fell away beneath him. He saw the Ryman Auditorium, the mother church of country music, looking small and dark amidst the glowing towers. He felt a pang of sadness. They were building castles in the sky, forgetting that the foundation was made of dirt and blood and 3 chords and the truth. The elevator doors opened onto the 35th floor. The noise hit him first. Not music, but the chatter of 100 keyboards, the hum of servers, the buzz of ambition. The office was an open-plan nightmare of glass walls and beanbag chairs. Heads turned as he walked down the central corridor. The clicking of keys stopped. Silence spread through the room like a wave. The young employees stared. To them, George Strait was a myth, a sample, a data set. Seeing him in the flesh, walking with that distinct cowboy gait, the sound of his boots heavy on the polished concrete floor, was jarring. He was real. He was solid. He was Judgment Day in a cowboy hat. George didn't look left or right. He kept his eyes fixed on the double-glass doors at the end of the hall. He could see Julian Vane inside, standing at the head of a long table, surrounded by sycophants. Vane was smiling, gesturing, looking like a man who owned the world. George reached the doors. He didn't knock, he pushed them open. The air in the conference room was cold, conditioned to protect the electronics. Julian Vane spread his arms wide, a shark's grin on his face. George, the man, the myth, Vane boomed. Welcome to the future. I knew you'd come. Look at this. He gestured to the wall of screens showing the viral explosion. We did it, George. We made you relevant to Gen Z. We've generated more impressions in 4 hours than your last 3 albums combined. George stood at the end of the table. He didn't smile. He didn't shake the offered hand. He looked at the screens, seeing the waveform of his dead friend's voice being dissected by strangers. Turn it off, George said. Vane chuckled, thinking it was a negotiating tactic. Turn it off, George, you don't understand. You can't turn off the internet. It's out there. It's decentralized. It's viral. We're just surfing the wave. Now, let's talk about the NFT rights. We're thinking of minting the first chorus as a unique token. The bidding starts at 2 million. George reached into his pocket. He pulled out the cassette tape. The plastic case was scratched, held together by a piece of yellowed Scotch tape. He threw it onto the glass table. It slid across the surface, spinning, and came to a stop right in front of Julian Vane. The sound of the plastic hitting the glass was sharp, like a gavel striking a block. That, George said, pointing to the tape, is the only master that exists. What you have is a copy of a copy. What you have is garbage. Vane looked at the tape, then back at George. He looked confused. So? The quality doesn't matter, it's the authenticity, it's the story. The story? George took a step closer. The room felt smaller. The executives around the table shifted in their ergonomic chairs, suddenly uncomfortable. "Let me tell you the story, son. That wasn't a session. That was a goodbye." Towns couldn't hold a pick that night. His hands were shaking too bad. I had to tape the pick to his fingers. He knew he was dying. I knew he was dying. We sang that song to God, not to an audience. We sang it to make peace with the dark. And 3 hours later, I was holding his head while he took his last breath. George's voice cracked, just a fraction. A hairline fracture in a granite wall. "You didn't find a song," George whispered. "You dug up a grave. You stole a man's last confession and you're selling tickets to it." The silence in the room was absolute. The screens flickered, the numbers still climbing, but no one was looking at them anymore. They were looking at the man who was stripping away their corporate armor with nothing but the truth. Vane's smile faltered. He adjusted his tie. He tried to regain control. He was a creature of logic, and this was emotional nonsense to him. "Mr. Strait, I respect your feelings, truly. But business is business. The file is public domain, essentially. We own the physical asset from the studio liquidation. Legally, we are in the clear. And frankly, it's too late. It's on the blockchain. You can't delete it. Not even I can delete it now. It's immutable. That's the beauty of the technology." Vane leaned back, regaining his arrogance. "You can't stop the signal, George. You're fighting a tsunami with a bucket." George looked at Vane for a long moment. He saw a man who was hollow, a man who had traded his soul for bandwidth. "I don't need to stop the signal," George said. "I just need to unplug the machine." "And how do you propose to do that?" Vane sneered. "We are hosted on the Olympus cloud servers, distributed across 3 continents, military-grade encryption. You'd need a global EMP to take us down." George reached into his pocket again. He didn't pull out a weapon. He pulled out an old flip phone. It was battered, taped together, a relic of the early 2000s. "I don't know about EMPs," George said, flipping the phone open. "But I know a man named Red McAllister." Vane frowned. "Who?" "Red McAllister," George repeated, dialing a number from memory. "We used to rope steers together back in '75. He was a terrible cowboy, couldn't stay on a horse to save his life. So he quit the rodeo and started fixing radios. Then he started building computers. Then he built a server farm in the desert. Now I believe he owns the parent company of the cloud service you just mentioned." Vane's face went white. Olympus Cloud was a subsidiary of McAllister Tech. Everyone knew that. But Red McAllister was a recluse, a billionaire who lived on a fortress ranch in West Texas and never took calls from Wall Street. George held the phone to his ear. It rang once. "George," a gravelly voice answered on speaker. "Is that you? I haven't heard from you since the Fort Worth show." "Hello, Red," George said. "I need a favor, a big one." "Name it, King," Red said. "I'm standing in an office in Nashville, a company called Streamline Digital. They're hosting a stolen file on your servers, a recording of Towns and me. They're selling it, Red. They're making a mockery of it." There was a pause on the line. A heavy, dangerous silence. "Towns?" Red asked. "The night he passed?" "Yes," George said. "Give me the server node," Red said. His voice was no longer friendly. It was the voice of a man who could buy and sell countries. George looked at Vane. "What's the node, son?" Vane was trembling. I can't. This is illegal. You can't just—" "The node," George said. "Node Alpha 9. Tyler the intern blurted out, terrified. "Cluster 4. "Did you get that, Red?" George asked. "Got it," Red said. "George, do you want me to just delete the file?" George looked at the screens, at the arrogance of the place, at the soulless architecture of greed. "No, Red," George said. "Kill it all." "Done," Red said. "Give me 10 seconds." Vane stood up, screaming. "You can't do this. We have investors. We have contracts. This is corporate sabotage." George just watched the clock on the wall. 10, 9, 8. The room held its breath. The hum of the servers seemed to pitch higher, screaming. 7, 6, 5. "It's too late," Vane yelled, typing frantically on his keyboard. "You can't." 4, 3, 2, 1. The lights in the room didn't go out, but the screens did. All of them. The massive wall of data went black. The monitors on the desks went black. The phones stopped ringing. The background hum of the high-speed connection died, leaving only the sound of the air conditioner blowing cold, useless air. "Error 404, Tyler whispered, looking at his dead tablet. "Server not found. Host unreachable. It's gone. The whole platform. Echo chamber is offline." Vane stared at the black screens. His empire had evaporated in 10 seconds, not by a hacker, not by a virus, but by a phone call between two old cowboys who remembered what honor meant. George closed his flip phone. The snap was the loudest sound in the room. He walked over to the table and picked up his cassette tape. He put it back in his pocket, right next to his heart. "You were right about one thing," George said to a stunned Julian Vane. "Technology is powerful, but friendship is permanent." George tipped his hat to the room. "Good evening, gentlemen." He turned and walked out. The walk down the hallway was long, but this time the silence wasn't out of shock. It was out of respect. He stepped into the elevator, the doors closing on the scene of digital devastation. As he walked out of the building and into the cool Nashville night, the valet was waiting with the truck. The engine was still running. George climbed in. He didn't look back at the tower. He drove toward the highway, heading west, chasing the moon back to Texas. Later that night, miles outside the city limits, George pulled the truck over to the side of a deserted dirt road. He got out. The crickets were singing, a natural choir that needed no bandwidth. He gathered some dry brush and twigs. He struck a match. He took the cassette tape out of his pocket. He looked at it one last time. He didn't need the recording to remember Towns. He carried Towns in his memory, in his music, in the way he treated people. The tape was just plastic. It was a fetter. He tossed the tape into the small fire. The plastic curled and melted, the magnetic ribbon consumed by the flames. The song rose up with the smoke, disappearing into the vast, starry sky, finally free, finally safe. George watched until the fire burned down to embers. Then he kicked dirt over the ashes, got back in his truck and drove home. The internet would forget in a week. The next viral trend would come along, but on a ranch in Texas, the king of country slept soundly, knowing that some things are not meant to be shared. They are meant to be kept. The silence that settled over the Texas ranch the morning after the server wipe was not the peaceful silence of nature. It was a heavy, suffocating stillness, the kind that precedes a tornado. George Strait sat on his front porch, a mug of black coffee steaming in his hand, watching the sunrise paint the sky in hues of bruised purple and angry orange. The cattle were restless in the lower pasture, sensing a disturbance in the air long before human ears could pick it up. Usually this was George's sanctuary, a fortress of solitude built on decades of hard work and humility. But today, the fortress was under siege. The first sign of the invasion was the sound. It started as a low thrumming in the distance, like a swarm of angry hornets. Within minutes, the sound grew into a roar. George didn't look up, but he knew what it was. Helicopters, news choppers from Dallas, Houston, and even national networks circling the perimeter of his property like vultures waiting for a carcass. The digital blackout caused by Red McAllister had not gone unnoticed. While the specific file of Towns Van Zandt had vanished, so had millions of dollars of other data hosted by Streamline Digital. The narrative had shifted overnight. George was no longer just a victim of a leak. In the eyes of the corporate world, he was a saboteur. His phone, the landline he had used to order the strike, began to ring again. He let it ring. He knew who it was. Lawyers, publicists, the vultures in suits who wanted to manage the damage. But George didn't believe in damage control. He believed in truth. Inside the house, Norma was pacing the kitchen. She was a strong woman, the bedrock of his life. But the intrusion of the world into their private haven was rattling her. "George," she said, her voice tight, "there are reporters at the main gate. The foreman says there are vans blocking the cattle guards. They're saying you destroyed a tech company. They're calling you a Luddite, a relic." George took a slow sip of his coffee. He stood up, his joints popping slightly in the morning chill. He walked into the kitchen and placed a hand on Norma's shoulder. His touch was steady, grounding. "Let them talk, Norma. Words don't plant seeds and they don't harvest corn. They're just wind." "But it's not just talk," she insisted, pointing to the small television on the counter. "Look, On the screen, a news anchor with perfectly coiffed hair and a serious expression was standing in front of the streamlined digital building in Nashville. The headline scrolled in bold red letters: "The day the music died. George Strait accused of digital terrorism." The camera cut to Julian Vane. The young CEO looked disheveled, his eyes red-rimmed, playing the victim with Oscar-worthy precision. He stood amidst the dark screens of his office, holding a microphone like a weapon. "Mr. Strait didn't just delete a song," Vane told the camera, his voice trembling with manufactured outrage. "He deleted the future. He destroyed the work of hundreds of young artists. He wiped out the cloud storage of innocent musicians who trusted us. He used his influence to pull the plug on innovation because he's afraid. He's afraid of a world where he doesn't control the gate. We are filing a lawsuit for $50 million in damages. We will take his ranch. We will take his royalties. We will leave him with nothing but his hat." George watched the screen, his expression unreadable. He saw the trap Vane was laying. Vane was pivoting. He knew he couldn't win the moral argument about the stolen tape, so he was making it about the innocent victims of the server crash. And the worst part was, Vane was partially right. George grabbed his hat from the rack. "Where are you going?" Norma asked. "I have to go to town," George said. "I need to see if there's any truth to what that boy is saying. If I hurt innocent folks, I need to know." He didn't take the truck this time. He took his horse, a sturdy bay quarter horse named Buster. He rode out the back way, cutting through the mesquite brush and dry creek beds, avoiding the media circus at the front gate. He rode for miles, the rhythm of the horse calming his mind, until he reached the back roads that led toward Austin. He had a friend pick him up in a beat-up sedan, and they drove in silence to the one place where George knew he could find the pulse of the real music scene: the Broken Spoke. The Broken Spoke was empty at this hour, save for the staff sweeping up from the night before and a solitary figure sitting at the bar. The air conditioner hummed its familiar tune. George walked in through the back door. The owner, James, looked up from wiping the counter. His eyes widened, but he didn't make a fuss. He just nodded. "In Texas, you don't fawn over legends, you buy them a beer." George sat at a booth in the shadows. He looked at the solitary figure at the bar. It was a young man, no older than 22. He had long, messy hair and was wearing a denim jacket that had seen better days. His head was in his hands and his shoulders were shaking. Beside him on the bar was a guitar case covered in stickers. George signaled James. "Give the kid whatever he's drinking, and bring me a shiner." James delivered the beers. The kid looked up, his eyes bloodshot. He didn't recognize George in the shadows under the brim of the hat. He just saw an older cowboy offering a kindness. "Thanks, mister," the kid mumbled, "but I don't think beer is going to fix this." "What's broken, son?" George asked, his voice low and gravelly. "Everything," the kid said. He pulled a napkin from the holder and shredded it. "My name's Caleb Thorne. I've been busking on 6th Street for 3 years, sleeping in my car, eating ramen. Last month I finally got a break. Streamlined Digital. They signed me to a distribution deal." George felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. "Go on," George said. "They offered to master my album for free if I uploaded the raw tracks to their cloud," Caleb continued. "It was everything I had. 12 songs, my life's work. Songs about my mom dying of cancer. Songs about growing up poor in Lubbock. I didn't have backups. I couldn't afford a hard drive. I trusted the cloud." Caleb took a long pull of the beer, tears leaking from his eyes. "Then yesterday it all went black. They say some hacker or some glitch wiped the servers. It's all gone, every note. Julian Vane sent an email saying, 'Force majeure.' They aren't liable. I have nothing left. I'm back to zero." The weight of the confession hung in the air. George sat perfectly still. He had acted to save the dignity of his dead friend, Towns. He had acted to stop a theft. But in doing so, he had swung a sword that was too heavy, and he had cut down the innocent standing next to the villain. He had become exactly what Vane accused him of being, a destroyer of dreams. George stood up. He walked out of the shadows and stood next to Caleb. The light from the neon sign caught his face. Caleb looked up, squinting. Then his jaw dropped. The beer bottle slipped from his hand and shattered on the floor. You're... Caleb stammered. "I'm the man who wiped the servers," George said. He didn't offer an excuse. He didn't blame Red McAllister. He took the weight. Caleb stood up, anger flaring in his eyes, mixing with awe. You did this? Why? Why would you do that to me? I didn't do it to you, son. But I did do it. And I'm sorry. Sorry doesn't bring my songs back, Caleb shouted. The despair in his voice cracked like a whip. Those songs were my ticket out. They were my soul. George looked at the shattered glass on the floor. He looked at the guitar case. Open the case, George commanded. What? Open the case. Caleb hesitated, confused by the shift in tone. Slowly he undid the latches. He pulled out a battered Gibson acoustic. It was scratched and worn, the wood dull. Can you play them? George asked. Caleb wiped his nose with his sleeve. Yeah, I wrote them. Of course I can play them. Then they aren't lost, George said. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a wad of cash. He threw it on the bar to cover the broken glass and the drinks. Digital files are just ghosts, Caleb. They're ones and zeros. They can be deleted, they can be corrupted, they can be stolen. But if you have it in your head and in your hands, nobody can take it from you. That's the difference between content and music. George turned toward the door. Grab your guitar. Where are we going? Caleb asked, grabbing the neck of the Gibson, stumbling to keep up. We're going to fix it, George said. You lost a digital record. I'm going to give you something better. They walked out into the blinding Texas sun. The paparazzi had somehow sniffed out George's location. As soon as they stepped out of the broken spoke, flashbulbs erupted. Microphones were shoved in their faces. Reporters shouted questions about the lawsuit, about the cyber attack, about George's sanity. Mr. Strait, is it true you're insolvent? Mr. Strait, do you hate the internet? Who is this kid? Is he an accomplice? George ignored them all. He opened the door of the beat-up sedan he had arrived in. Get in, he told Caleb. As they drove away, leaving the media in a cloud of dust, George made a call on his flip phone, not to Red McAllister this time, but to a man named Bubba, his longtime band leader. Bubba, get the ace and the whole band together, meet me at the ranch, bring the mobile recording unit and bring plenty of tape. Analog tape, we're making a record. The drive back to the ranch was tense. Caleb was silent, processing the fact that he was sitting next to the king of country, fleeing a media mob. George was silent because he was planning a war. He knew Vane wouldn't stop with a lawsuit. Vane would try to destroy him publicly. When they arrived at the ranch, they had to use the service entrance again. The crowd at the main gate had doubled. There were protesters now, young kids holding signs that said "Digital Freedom" and "Down with the Gatekeepers," likely paid for by Streamline Digital. They entered the main house. Norma was waiting. She saw the boy with the guitar and the look on George's face. She didn't ask questions. She just started making sandwiches. For the next 3 days, the ranch became a fortress of sound. The Ace in the Hole band set up in the living room. They moved the expensive furniture and replaced it with drum kits, steel guitars and fiddles. There were no computers, no auto-tune, no digital interfaces, just microphones, cables, and a massive reel-to-reel tape machine that smelled of ozone and warm oil. George didn't sing. He sat in the producer's chair. He made Caleb play. At first, Caleb was terrified. His voice shook. He tried to mimic the pop country sound he thought was popular. "Stop," George would say, cutting the music. "You're singing for the radio. Sing for your mother. Sing the truth." Hour by hour, layer by layer, George stripped away the kid's affectations. He taught him that a pause is as loud as a scream. He taught him that a wrong note played with the right emotion is better than a perfect note played without heart. Outside the walls of the ranch, the world was burning. Julian Vane had gone on national television to announce the lawsuit. He was suing George for $50 million. He had frozen George's bank accounts through a preliminary injunction. The streaming services, fearing backlash, had pulled George's catalog from their featured playlists. The industry was turning its back on the legend, but inside the living room, magic was happening. Caleb was pouring his grief into the microphone. The songs were raw, dusty, and real. They sounded like Texas. On the evening of the third day, they finished the last track. Caleb was exhausted, his fingers bleeding, his voice raspy. They listened to the playback on the big studio monitors. It was undeniable. It was a masterpiece of Americana. George stood up and shook Caleb's hand. "Now you have a record, son. And this one can't be deleted because I'm giving you the master tapes. They belong to you. Not a label, not a cloud. You. Caleb looked at the reels of tape. He was crying again, but this time they were tears of redemption. Thank you, Mr. Strait. I don't know how to repay you. You don't, George said. You just pass it on. Suddenly, the front door burst open. It was George's lawyer, a man named Jim, looking pale and sweaty. George, we have a problem. A big one. What is it, Jim? Julian Vane is here. He's at the front gate, and he's not alone. He brought the sheriff. He has a court order to seize assets to secure the lawsuit. He says the ranch is collateral. He wants to come in and inventory your property. Norma gasped. They can't do that. This is our home. George's face hardened into stone. He looked at Caleb. He looked at his band. He looked at his wife. He wants a show, George said quietly. Let's give him one. George walked to the gun cabinet. He didn't take a rifle. He took his guitar, his signature black acoustic. Open the gate, George told the lawyer. Let him in. 10 minutes later, a convoy of black SUVs rolled up the driveway, flanked by sheriff's deputies who looked embarrassed to be there. Julian Vane stepped out of the lead vehicle. He was wearing a suit that shimmered in the twilight. He looked at the ranch house with a sneer of ownership. Behind the convoy, the press had breached the perimeter. Cameras were rolling. This was the moment Vane had orchestrated, the humiliation of the king. Vane walked up to the porch steps, holding a sheaf of papers. Mr. Strait, Vane announced, his voice amplified for the cameras. By order of the court, we are here to assess the value of this property against the damages you caused. You are a bankrupt man, George. You are history. George stepped out onto the porch. He was holding his guitar. He stood alone. He looked at the sheriff. Hello, Sheriff, George said. Evening, George, the sheriff muttered, tipping his hat. I'm sorry about this. It's a judge's order. My hands are tied. I understand, George said. He turned his gaze to Julian Vane. The young CEO was smirking. He thought he had won. He thought he had deconstructed the myth. You think you can buy this? George asked, gesturing to the land. You think you can quantify this? It's just real estate, George, Vane laughed. Just like music is just data. It all has a price, and you can't pay yours. George didn't speak. He strummed a chord, a G chord. It rang out loud and clear in the evening air. Then he began to play. He didn't play one of his hits. He didn't play Amarillo by Morning or The Chair. He played a song he had just written in his head while watching Caleb record. A song about the difference between a man's word and a man's net worth. His voice, rich and timeless, washed over the crowd. It silenced the reporters. It made the deputies shuffle their feet. You can steal the silver. You can steal the gold. You can put a price tag on the things you hold. But you can't buy the thunder, and you can't buy the rain, and you'll never own the spirit of the Texas plain. As he sang, something shifted. The common people began to arrive. Not the press, not the lawyers, but the neighbors, the ranchers from down the road, the mechanics from town, the waitresses from the diner. They had heard what was happening. They had seen the news, and they were not going to let a city slicker take George Strait's home. Trucks started pulling up the driveway, blocking the exit of the black SUVs. Horse trailers, tractors. It was a silent, peaceful army of dusty boots and calloused hands. They didn't have weapons. They just stood there, a human wall of solidarity. Julian Vane looked around, his smirk fading. He saw the faces of the people. He saw the cowboys leaning against their trucks, arms crossed. He saw the bikers from the local VFW chapter lining up along the fence. "This is intimidation," Vane squeaked. "Sheriff, arrest them." The sheriff looked at the crowd. He looked at Vane. "They aren't breaking any laws, son," the sheriff drawled. "They're just listening to music. It's a free country." George finished the song. He let the last note hang in the air. He looked Vane in the eye. "You can take my money, son. You can take the house. But you can't take the music, because the music lives in them." He pointed to the crowd. He pointed to Caleb, who was standing by the door, clutching his master tapes. "And you made a mistake," George added softly. "You thought you were fighting a man, but you picked a fight with a family." Vane was sweating now. The opticals were terrible. The live stream comments were turning against him. The narrative of George the Bully was collapsing in the face of George the Legend, but Vane was desperate. He played his last card. "This is touching, really," Vane spat, "but it doesn't change the law. You owe $50 million. Unless you have that in your pocket, we are seizing this property." A low rumble came from the road, a sound deeper than the trucks, a sleek black limousine, followed by a convoy of heavy-duty utility vehicles with satellite dishes on top, pushed through the crowd. The vehicles bore a logo that everyone in Texas knew, but few ever saw: McAllister Tech. The limousine stopped right in front of Vane's SUV. The back door opened. An old man stepped out. He was wearing a tuxedo jacket with blue jeans and cowboy boots. He leaned on a cane made of pure silver. It was Red McAllister, the billionaire recluse. The crowd gasped. Red hadn't been seen in public in 20 years. He hobbled up to the porch steps, ignoring Vane completely. He looked at George. "Hello, King," Red rasped. "Hello, Red," George smiled. "Nice of you to drop by. I heard there was a dispute about a bill," Red said, his voice carrying like thunder. Vane stepped forward, trembling. "Mr. McAllister, sir, I work for you. Well, indirectly. Streamline is a partner. You were a partner," Red corrected him, looking at Vane like he was something he stepped in. "Until you tried to foreclose on my best friend." Red turned to the sheriff. "Sheriff, what is the alleged debt?" $50 million, the sheriff said. Red reached into his jacket pocket. He pulled out a checkbook. He uncapped a gold pen. He scribbled on the check, tore it out, and flicked it at Vane. It fluttered to the ground, landing in the dirt at Vane's expensive Italian shoes. "There's $50 million, Red said, "plus another 10 for your trouble. Now get off my friend's land." Vane stared at the check. It was real. It was more money than he had ever seen, but it was also a dismissal, a public castration of his power. "But the lawsuit, the principle," Vane stammered. "The principle," Red interrupted, "is that you don't mess with Texas, and you certainly don't mess with George Strait." Red turned back to George. "By the way, George, I checked the server logs before I wiped them. It turns out Mr. Vane here has been skimming royalties from his artists for 3 years, funneling it into offshore accounts. I imagine the FBI will be here in about 20 minutes. Vane's eyes bulged. He looked at his lawyers. They were already backing away, checking their phones, distancing themselves. The crowd erupted in cheers. Hats flew into the air. Caleb Thorne ran onto the porch and hugged George. George didn't cheer. He just nodded to Red. "Thank you, Red. Don't thank me," Red grunted. "Just play another song. I drove 2 hours for this." George looked at Vane, who was now frantically trying to get into his SUV, realizing his empire was not just broken, but criminalized. George stepped up to the microphone one last time. "This one is for the ones who lost something," George said, looking at Caleb, "and for the ones who found it again." He started to play The Cowboy Rides Away, but the story wasn't over. As the music played and the sun set, a black sedan pulled up to the edge of the property. The window rolled down just an inch. A figure watched from the darkness inside. It wasn't the FBI. It wasn't a fan. It was a woman, elegant, sharp, and cold. She watched Julian Vane being handcuffed by the arriving federal agents. She watched George Strait celebrating with his people. She picked up a satellite phone. "Phase 1 failed," she said in a voice devoid of accent or emotion. "Vane was incompetent. Initiate the contingency. We don't need the file. We need the source. Target the archives in Nashville. Burn the history. If we can't own it, no one will remember it." She hung up. George finished his song, unaware that while he had won the battle for his home and his friend's honor, the war against the erasure of history had just begun. The enemy wasn't just a greedy CEO anymore. It was something much older and much darker. The dust had barely settled on the driveway of the ranch, and the tire tracks of the federal agents were still fresh in the dirt. But George Strait knew the war was not over. The victory against Julian Vane had been loud and public, a triumph of the old guard over the new. But George had been in the music business long enough to know that when you cut off the head of a snake, 2 more usually grow in its place. The silence that followed the chaos was deceptive. It was the silence of a predator holding its breath. Inside the ranch house, the mood was one of cautious celebration. Caleb Thorne sat at the kitchen table, staring at the master tapes of his new album, The Red Dirt Sessions, as if they were made of gold. Norma was frying chicken, the smell of comfort food filling the air, trying to restore the domestic rhythm that had been so rudely interrupted. But George stood by the window, looking out into the darkness where the black sedan had been parked hours ago. He had seen it. He had felt the cold gaze from within. Julian Vane was a fool, a boy playing with matches, but whoever was in that sedan was the arsonist. The phone rang. Not the landline this time, but the burner phone Red McAllister had left on the porch table before disappearing into the night. George picked it up. "It's Red," the voice rasped. "You need to turn on the news, George. Channel 5, Nashville feed." George walked into the living room and clicked on the TV. The screen was filled with orange. Fire. A massive, raging inferno that was consuming a brick building in the heart of Nashville's historic district. The chyron at the bottom of the screen read, "Breaking news, catastrophic fire at the Nashville Music Archive." George's blood ran cold. The archive wasn't just a warehouse, it was the vault. It was the place where the physical history of the genre was stored, not the digitized copies, but the paper, the ink, the acetate, and the vinyl. It held the handwritten lyrics of Hank Williams, the stage costumes of Patsy Cline, and, crucially, the original analog master tapes of every independent session recorded between 1970 and 1990, the very era the corporate giants were trying to erase to avoid paying royalties. "It's not an accident, is it, Red?" George asked, watching the flames lick the night sky. "No," Red said. "It's a liquidation. I did some digging on the shell company that backed Vane. It leads back to a conglomerate called Ethelgard. They specialize in AI training models. Their new directive is historical sanitization. If the original physical evidence doesn't exist, their AI-generated versions become the legal standard. They are burning the past to own the future, George." George hung up the phone. He looked at Caleb. The boy was watching the fire on the screen, his face pale. That's where they keep the backlog," Caleb whispered. "The stuff that hasn't been digitized yet. If that burns..." "If that burns," George finished, "it's like it never happened." George grabbed his keys. "Caleb, grab your gear, we're going back." "Back to Nashville?" Caleb asked, wide-eyed. "Tonight?" "We fly," George said. "If we leave now, we can be there in 2 hours." Norma came out of the kitchen, wiping her hands on a towel. She saw the fire in George's eyes, a reflection of the fire on the screen. She knew she couldn't stop him. She walked over and kissed him on the cheek. "Bring it home, George," she said softly. "Don't let them burn the memories." The flight was turbulent, mirroring the storm brewing on the ground. As the Falcon 900 descended toward Nashville, the glow of the fire was visible from 20,000 feet. It looked like a wound in the earth, bleeding light. They landed and took the rental truck, speeding toward the district. The streets were blocked by fire trucks and police barricades. The heat was palpable from 3 blocks away. The air tasted of ash and melted plastic. George slammed the truck into park and jumped out. He wasn't wearing his stage hat. He was wearing a heavy canvas coat and a wet bandana around his neck. Caleb followed, looking terrified but determined. They pushed through the crowd of onlookers. People were crying. Old musicians, songwriters, historians. They stood helpless as the building groaned under the assault of the flames. "You can't go in there," a firefighter shouted, blocking George's path. "The roof is unstable. It's going to collapse." George looked at the building. The fire had consumed the front offices, but the rear vault, a reinforced concrete bunker attached to the main structure, was still intact, though the flames were licking at its heavy steel doors. "The vault!" George shouted over the roar of the fire. "Is the vault breached?" "Not yet," the firefighter yelled back. "But the heat is going to cook everything inside within minutes. We can't risk men to save old tapes." "I can," George said. He didn't wait for permission. He didn't wait for a plan. He ran. He ducked under the yellow tape and sprinted toward the side alley that led to the vault's service entrance. "George!" Caleb screamed, running after him. They reached the heavy steel door of the vault. It was hot to the touch. The electronic keypad was melted, a useless lump of plastic. "It's sealed!" Caleb yelled, coughing in the thick smoke. George looked around. He saw a fireman's axe lying in the rubble near a discarded hose. He grabbed it. The weight felt familiar, like a heavy guitar, but with a deadly purpose. "Stand back, son," George commanded. He swung the axe. He didn't aim for the lock, he aimed for the hinges. He swung with the strength of a man who had built miles of fence post by post. Clang, clang, clang. The sound rang out, a rhythmic counterpoint to the roaring fire. Sparks flew. His muscles burned. The smoke stung his eyes, blinding him. But he kept swinging. He was chopping wood. He was breaking a horse. He was fighting for the truth. With a final guttural roar, the top hinge gave way. The door groaned and skewed sideways. George dropped the axe and shoved his shoulder against the hot steel. Caleb joined him. Together, the old legend and the new blood pushed against the weight of the inevitable. The door screeched open just enough for a man to squeeze through. "Stay here," George told Caleb. "Pass the boxes to me. Do not come inside." "No way," Caleb said, pulling his shirt over his nose. "We do this together." They slipped into the darkness of the vault. Inside, the air was stiflingly hot, but the fire hadn't breached the walls yet. Emergency lights flickered red, casting long, dancing shadows. Rows upon rows of shelves stretched out, filled with reels of magnetic tape, boxes of lyric sheets, and cases of instruments. It was a tomb of giants. "Grab the master reels," George ordered. "The section marked Independence 1970-1990. That's what they want to destroy." They worked frantically. George grabbed armfuls of tapes, tossing them into a rolling canvas cart. Caleb was grabbing boxes of documents. The heat was rising. The ceiling of the vault began to creak. The concrete was expanding, cracking under the thermal stress. Suddenly, a figure stepped out from the shadows at the far end of the aisle. It wasn't a ghost. It was a woman. She was wearing a sleek, fire-resistant tactical suit and a gas mask. She held a flare gun in her hand. It was the woman from the sedan, the architect, Elena Vance. "You are persistent, Mr. Strait." Her voice came through the mask, distorted and metallic. "Most men your age are content with golf." George froze, a stack of tapes in his hands. "You started this. I am finishing it," she said calmly. "Efficiency is the ultimate virtue. This clutter, this messy, emotional debris, it hinders progress. The AI needs a clean slate, perfect music, mathematically optimized, without the baggage of copyright or human error." She raised the flare gun, aiming it not at George but at the shelves of nitrate film behind him, highly flammable explosive material. "Get out, George," she said. "I have no quarrel with you personally. You are a legacy asset, but this trash needs to burn." "Trash?" George stepped forward. The fear was gone, replaced by a cold, hard Texas resolve. "You call Johnny Cash's handwritten prayers trash? You call the sound of a mother singing to her child trash? You don't know what music is, lady. You just know math." "Math is forever," she said. "Flesh is temporary." She pulled the trigger. The flare hissed through the air, a streak of magnesium white. George didn't dive for cover, he didn't run. He swung the heavy canvas cart he was holding, intercepting the flare in mid-air. The flare struck the side of the cart, embedding itself in the thick canvas, sizzling harmlessly away from the nitrate film. "Caleb, tackles!" George shouted, using a rodeo term. Caleb didn't hesitate. He dropped the boxes and launched himself at Elena. He wasn't a fighter, but he was desperate. He hit her at the waist, driving her back into the shelves. Tape reels rained down on them like hail. Elena was trained, but she wasn't expecting the ferocity of a kid fighting for his soul. She kicked him off, scrambling to her feet, reaching for a canister of accelerant she had placed on the floor. But George was there. He loomed over her, a silhouette against the red emergency lights. He kicked the canister away, sending it skittering into the darkness. "This is hallowed ground," George growled, "and you are trespassing." The building above them gave a terrifying groan. Dust poured from the ceiling. A beam crashed down in the hallway outside, blocking the exit. "The roof is going," Caleb yelled, scrambling up. Elena looked at the blocked exit, then at George. For the first time, panic flickered in her eyes. The cold logic of her plan hadn't accounted for the chaos of a collapsing building. "We're trapped," she whispered. George looked at the blocked door, then at the heavy ventilation grate high on the back wall. It was small but big enough. "Caleb, the vent!" George pointed. "Stack the crates!" They frantically stacked the heavy plastic crates of tapes. George grabbed Elena by the arm. She flinched, expecting a blow. "Climb," George ordered. "Why?" she asked, confused. "I tried to burn you." "I know," George said, "but I'm a cowboy. We don't leave people behind, even the ones who don't deserve it." He hoisted her up. She scrambled into the vent shaft. Caleb followed, pushing a box of the most critical master tapes ahead of him. "Come on, George!" Caleb yelled, reaching his hand down. George looked back at the vault. He couldn't save it all. Thousands of songs were going to burn. But he had saved the core. He had saved the spirit. He climbed the stack of crates. His lungs were burning, his age catching up to him. He grabbed Caleb's hand. The boy pulled with all his might. George squeezed into the vent just as the main roof of the warehouse collapsed. The sound was apocalyptic. The vault shook violently. The floor where they had just been standing was buried under tons of burning debris. They crawled through the dark, soot-choked tunnel, the heat radiating through the metal below them. They emerged into the cool night air in the alleyway behind the building, tumbling out onto the wet asphalt, coughing and gasping. Firefighters rushed over, dousing them with water. Helena Vance sat on the pavement, her mask off. She looked at the burning building, then at George, who was leaning against a brick wall, wiping soot from his face with his bandana. She looked at the box of tapes Caleb was clutching like a baby. She stood up slowly. The sirens of police cars were closing in. She looked at George one last time. "You can't stop the future," she said, but her voice lacked its earlier conviction. "Maybe not," George said, standing tall, looking like a statue forged in fire. "But we can make sure the past survives to teach it some manners." She turned and walked toward the police, holding her hands out in surrender. The logic of her algorithm had failed. The human variable, courage, was something she couldn't code. 3 months later. The Broken Spoke was packed, not just with locals, but with people from all over the world. They had come to see the reopening of the dance hall, which had been renovated with funds donated anonymously, though everyone knew the check had come from a ranch south of San Antonio. The stage was lit with warm yellow lights. The smell of chicken fried steak and cold beer filled the air. Caleb Thorne stood at the microphone. He looked older, wiser. He was wearing a new hat, a gift from a mentor. He held his battered Gibson guitar. "This next song," Caleb said, his voice steady, "is the title track of my new album. It's called Fire and Tape, and I want to bring up a friend to help me sing it." The crowd roared as George Strait walked onto the stage. He wasn't wearing a tuxedo. He was in his Wranglers and a crisp button-down shirt. He strapped on his guitar and smiled, that crooked, genuine smile that had charmed the world for 40 years. They didn't play a loud, raucous anthem. They played a ballad, a song about how things change. But the truth remains the same. The wires may hum and the screens may glow, but the heart of a man is the only thing I know. You can burn the paper, you can wipe the drive, but as long as we're singing, the music's alive. As they harmonized on the chorus, George looked out at the crowd. He saw young kids dancing with their grandparents. He saw people holding up lighters, not phones. He saw a community that had been threatened by the cold hand of technology and had chosen the warmth of human connection instead. In the back of the room, Red McAllister sat in a booth, tapping his silver cane to the rhythm. He nodded at George. The war for the soul of music would continue. There would be new formats, new greedy executives, new technologies promising to make humans obsolete. But as long as there was a wooden stage, a 6-string guitar, and a story to tell, the cowboy would always ride. George hit the final chord. It rang out, hanging in the air, perfect and fading, not into silence, but into history. "Thank you," George said into the microphone. "Good night." He unplugged his guitar, put his arm around Caleb, and they walked off the stage together, leaving the light on for whoever was next.